this is a very serious thing now. We're doing the shir in memory of Jeff Kaplan. I actually don't know his father's Hebrew name. We only knew the name we were davening for him, which is his mother's Hebrew name. I don't want to ask his wife because it's just like, I don't want to bug her at the moment, obviously. But Hashem knows we're speaking about Jeff Kaplan. And I can tell you something. He taught me a lot of Torah. I was with him every Shabbos for years and years and years. And he was very learned. He used to teach at Keter Torah. Our viewpoints were different on many things, but that's how you grow. If you share the same view, there's no growth. And in terms of the shir, I'd obviously like to dedicate it not only to Jeff Kaplan, but there are two people that are ill at the moment that I want to dedicate it to, that are in hospital. It's Ronnie Lurie's brother, Adi Lurie. I'm not sure of Adi's Hebrew name just offhand. And obviously I want to dedicate it to Ronnie's brother-in-law. He's 30, not 31 or 32, and he's on breathing equipment. Okay? COVID. So this COVID's very serious. And Kevin, let's dedicate the shir for your mom to make a full refuah, because your mom, I care about very much, as do you. I'm sure it's Shefra Simcha Bajeta. I mean,
that's it. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Okay. So the Melacha is laundering, and under laundering, there's a section on clothing. Okay. So
the last
soiled
or good. The last 3 bullet points. You've done 3. There's 3 left.
Okay. Jeez, did I do that? Is it what I've...
Trust me, I've memorized.
Jeez, okay. Oh, yes, okay. The last 3. Okay, sure. Okay, so one may not hang up laundry to dry, even though it has been washed before Shabbos. Clothing accidentally made damp, for example, from rain, may not be hung over or near a heater, but may be left out to dry if it is apparent that it had not been washed. One may clean eyeglasses with a dry cloth even if the spectacles are wet. And before placing a baby on one's lap, it is advisable to spread out a piece of material on one's clothing to prevent the clothing from becoming soiled and the subsequent temptation to clean them. Okay, and there's just one in fabrics. It's just one point on fabrics. One may not squeeze wet fabrics, even if they are not being laundered. Absorbent materials, therefore, may not be used for washing dishes. One may use nylon brushes or plastic scourers, which do not hold water. Steel wool may not be used. So the main thing is you mustn't be able to squeeze any liquid or water out of anything, because that's a melacha. It's forbidden to do such a thing.
Okay. All right.
Okay, that's it. Yeah.
I wanted to know, it would be interesting to find out if you could squeeze a sponge underwater where it absorbs water and releases it, because it's releasing water back to water. Just curious.
I'm sure that it's but you're still squeezing, even though it's getting.
I'm saying nothing's coming out or in; it's staying within the same environment. I'm curious. We're going to begin the shir now. We're just going to do a summary of the 40th daf. Now the new format is after Keith teaches, we give over the daf and 5 minutes in the end for questions. Our goal is to do 2 dafs a week, so that we can, please God, finish Bava Kamma by exactly this time next year. The reason being is life is like my heart, short. So let's make sure that we can do as much as possible. Now, I know there might be a bit of unhappiness that there's less questions and interaction throughout. I'm suggesting that you all keep a pen and pad next to you and write down any questions that you have at the end for 2 reasons. The first reason is that I don't want to spend the next 2 years doing Bava Kamma when we can accomplish it in the next year. And the thing of it is, the Gemara will definitely, any question that you have, if your question is accurate, because it's aligned to the Gemara is about to answer it. That's number one. And if your question is not accurate, you're going to confuse everybody. So there's no point. So if it's accurate, we'll answer it. Anyway, that's the logic of the Gemara. And if it's not, let's leave the confusion out. However, at the end, once we've gotten a whole pattern and flow of the Gemara, your questions are going to be of the highest quality, because it's going to relate to not a question when we've got 1/10 of the picture, but 9/10 of the picture. That's a quality question. I don't know if you guys concur with our goal. It meant that my Shabbos is socially over, meaning that I can't go anywhere for lunches apart from the quarantine, because lunches will drag out. And a Friday night, I start my learning until the end of Saturday with a couple of sleeps in between. So I'm prepared to do this for you guys. Now, I'm suggesting that when you study the daf in repetition, that you can refrain from learning the notes, because you're not going to have time for 2 dafs and the notes. There's no ways. I don't see how. Not if you want a bit of a social life. The cat's scratching at the door, but I don't want it to come during the shear, so she'll recover.
You don't necessarily always need the notes, because it's you get the flow better without the notes.
I think so.
There is an advantage of not always reading the notes.
In fact, before I learn the notes, I just read it, and then I get a flow and just get a sense of it in a broad brush stroke sort of perspective, as Gavin says. And then the notes give you the minutiae of detail. All right, guys, let's get on with that. I'm just going to share where we're holding. Just hang on one sec. Hi, Neil, can I phone you? Shavua Tov. I'm giving a shir, my Gemara shir. Can I call you back when I'm finished?
Sure thing.
All right.
Bye.
You too. All right. All right, guys, let's get started. We'll try this new method for approximately a month and see how we go. All right. So, let me just fly through it. The Gemara cites the Brisa's second clause. If one borrowed an ox and it became a muad in the house of the borrower, and he returned it to the owners and it gored there, the owners pay half damages and the borrower is exempt from paying anything. Okay? The Gemara draws an inference from the second clause and contrasts it with what was applied in the Brisa's first clause. Okay? Because the Brisa's second clause, we see that coming under a new jurisdiction alters the legal status of a muad ox, rendering it tam. Because if it says, look, if it was tam and then it was borrowed, and then under the care of the borrower it became muad, and when it's returned to the owner only has to pay half damages. It's implying it returns back to its tam status, especially since the borrower is exempt from paying anything. That's the second clause. Now, the first clause we learned, listen, you've got an owner, and he fails to disclose to the borrower that the ox is tam. Sorry, the ox is muad. So then all of a sudden there's drama, and that ox gores. Then the owner has to pay half payment damages, and the borrower has to pay half payment damages. Why? Because he failed to disclose that the ox was muad. Okay? And that's proving that, in fact, the ox retains its muad status. Otherwise, the borrower would only have to pay half payment damages. That's the proof. So we see here there's a contradiction. This is just a quick repeat of Thursday. So we want to know, why is there a contradiction? So Rav Yochanan says it's indeed a contradiction. However, the one who taught this part of the Brisa did not teach that part of it. The Brisa's 2 clauses reflect the views of 2 different Tanaim. One holds that coming under new jurisdiction alters the ox's legal status, and the other holds it does not. So we're saying, Kev, listen, I want to ask you something, Kevin. Is that your camera is facing odd? I'm seeing the side of your head.
Yeah, I'm turned sideways. I just want to give my eyes a break sometimes from the screen.
Oh, okay. Because you were looking at the screen the whole Shabbos, right?
Yeah. I do it just for a few minutes at a time. Tum. Not a tum.
I could understand during the workday and Shabbos. I'm not sure what you were watching, you naughty boy. Okay, let's go back. So we say, look, Rav Yochanan is saying something very simple. Of course, they had two different opinions. The first part of the Bryce and the second part of the Bryce. So why? Because they're written by two different Anoim. Nothing to discuss. So that makes sense. There's a second answer by Rabbah, who said, look, since the first clause holds that coming under a new jurisdiction does not alter the ox's status, the second clause must also be consistent and hold that coming under a new jurisdiction does not alter the ox's status. As for the ruling propounded in this second clause that the ox reverts to tam status when returned to the owner, this is the reason. Because the owner says to the borrower, it's not within your power to render my ox a muad. Meaning, look, Rabbi is saying there's a general rule that it's by one Tana and the opinion is consistent. Just like in the first section of the Brisa, we see that if it's muad with the owner, it remains muad with the borrower, and it doesn't revert back to its tam status when it changes its jurisdiction. We can see that the second part of the Brisa is also written by the same Tana. So then the question is, how do you then explain it? How do you explain the contradiction? So I said, look, that is the general rule, but there is an exception. The exception is when the owner says to the borrower, it's not within your power to render my ox a muad, which means in this particular circumstance, you didn't take trouble to guard it properly. So you can't render it a muad, because if you had guarded it properly, it would never have gored. That's according to Rashi. So therefore, although the ox is deemed a muad while it is under the care of the borrower, it does not remain a muad after its return to the owners, where it will be properly washed over. Okay. So according to Rabbah, the two clauses of the Brisa represent the view of a single Tana who holds that coming under new jurisdiction does not render a muad a tam. Although the second clause basically rules that the animal reverts to tam status after returning to its owners, that's only because in this particular case, its previous muad status was due solely to the borrower's defective guarding. So he's saying basically, Rabbi, that this is exceptional circumstances. But as a general rule, in other words, if the borrower looked after it reasonably well, then it would maintain its muad status. But the only reason it was at a tam status, went to muad and back to tam, is because the borrower was completely neglectful. But in normal circumstances where the borrower was reasonable and looked after it, it wouldn't have escalated to this point. So it would have remained consistent. Okay. I did a bit of further review, guys, and pushed with this one. Fine. Thanks. Now, Rav Papa has got a different reason. He's saying, look, the second clause holds that coming under new jurisdiction alters the ox's status. The first clause must also hold that coming under a new jurisdiction alters the ox's status. Why? Because they're both by the same Tana. As for the ruling propounded in the first clause, that even after coming under jurisdiction of the borrower, the ox remains a muad, this is the reason. So what we are saying is, hang on, Rabbah and Rav Papa have got opposites. Rabbah says that it stays the status between the owner and the borrower back to the owner. But Rav Papa says the status changes. When it goes from the borrower, or we could say the court-appointed agent, back to the owner, it reverts back to the status it was originally with the owner. That's what Rav Papa is saying. So they say to Rav Papa, well, how do you answer the fact that if we look at the first section of the Brisa, we can see that it seems to keep the status the same, because the original owner, the ox, was muad, right? And then he failed to disclose it to the borrower. The ox went crazy, and then for failing to disclose it, now he has to pick up half the bill of the fee for the damage, because the borrower borrowed it under the assumption it was tam. So this proves that the ox does not alter its status. So it's saying to Rav Papa, well, how can you say this, that it's consistent? So Rav Papa says generally. that when it returns back to the jurisdiction of the owner, it was the same status as when it was originally with the owner. The fact that it was with the borrower, the court-appointed agent, is not a permanent status. So they say, well, okay, then explain in this case with Rav Papa why the exception would occur, where the ox would retain its status. And Rav Papa says, look, because wherever a borrowed ox goes, the name of its owner is upon it. Okay? So what does this mean? It means even after the borrower takes possession of the ox, it remains to some degree under the jurisdiction of the owner. Okay? Rav Papa, like Rabbi, basically holds that the Bryce's two clauses represent the view of a single Tana. So that's what they have in common. But Rav Papa maintains that the Tana holds that a new jurisdiction does alter the ox's status from Muad to Tam. Nevertheless, the Bryce rules in its first clause that an animal transferred from an owner to a borrower retains its status as a Muad, because the transfer to the borrower is not regarded as a true change in ownership. That's to say that whenever a borrowed ox goes, the name of its owner is upon it. So what we are saying there is that there seems to be an obligation that if the ox will change its status back to Tam, the only reason why the first clause probably, according to Rav Papa, is that it remained Muad, is because who was remiss here to a certain extent? This is me surmising the owner, because the owner never actually was honest with the borrower and said, listen, it's a Muad ox. It's a Muad ox. Because we've learned something, that if the ox is observed to chill out, because we've learned halachas of how does an ox chill out. In other words, it refrains from the activity that caused it to become muad. It reverts back to tam. So technically can revert back to tam with the borrower. But if the borrower is not aware of the previous status, who's to blame? The owner. That's why sharing in the payment. But generally it can revert back to a tam status. Only in this case not. Because the name goes, whose name gets affected here? The owner, because the borrower is carrying the owner's name. If you borrow my car and you wreck it, it's going to come back to haunt me, not you. Okay, let's go on to the next part. I'm just going to share screen for 1 sec, and then we are ready, guys. Just give me 1 second. So in summation, here, this is what we have. Jurisdiction change from borrower or agent to the owner and vice versa. So Rav Yochanan says there are two different Tanaim. One says that obviously the status reverts and changes with the jurisdiction, and one Tana says no. Rabba says it doesn't alter the status, because and why is the exception in this case? Because the owner says to the borrower, it's not in your power to render my ox a muad, meaning if you've completely been neglectful and haven't looked after it, why should I now become muad because you were neglectful? Generally, though, it doesn't alter its status, meaning if it was muad, if it was tam with me and you've looked after it well, but it's beyond your control what happened, then it stays tam when it comes back to me. It doesn't alter. Rav Papa says it does alter the status, meaning it's tam with me, you don't look after it properly, it comes back to me tam. But why is the exception in the first case? Because wherever an ox goes, the name of the owner goes with it unless it is sold. Okay? Meaning a person's name is associated with the borrower. And in this particular case, I'm actually surmising that the reason that it stays muad is because it hasn't refrained from goring either. It would have to also change its nature, the animal, or show a different behavior. Because even if it's under the current owner, unless it differs from goring, it should remain muad. Am I making sense to you guys? That wouldn't change. If I owned it, even if I can't just give it to somebody and it comes back and it continues with its behavior and now suddenly it's magic. We're saying it has to refrain. Maybe under new ownership, it's calmed down. I don't know. All right, so let's go to the next part, which is going to be a little bit more complicated. All right. The Mishnah states, an ox of the arena that killed a person is not liable to death, etc. For the verse that mandates the death penalty for an ox that killed is stated, if an ox gores. This implies, but not an ox that is taught to gore or compelled to gore. So the Gemara poses an inquiry. They inquired, what is the law regarding bringing an ox of the arena as an offering upon the altar? We know that scripture excludes an ox that killed a person from being brought as an offering. Does the exclusion only apply to an ox that killed by choice, or even one that was trained to kill? Okay. And where's this from? Leviticus chapter 1, verse 2 to 8. We read that the other day. All right. So there's a dispute. Rav says an ox of the arena is valid as an offering, but Shmuel said it is invalid as an offering. So the Gemara elaborates. Rav said it's valid because the ox was coerced into killing. Since it did not kill by choice, it's not covered by the general exclusion. But Shmuel said it's not valid, for behold, a sin has been committed with it. So basically, sorry guys, I've got something. We can understand where Rav's point of view, and the Gemara is going to question Shmuel's point of view. So they challenge Shmuel's point of view from the following brisa. When the verse states that sacrificial offerings may be brought from the animals, it comes to exclude the following animals, right? An animal that sodomized a person and an animal that was sodomized by a person. That's bestiality. When it comes to exclude other animals that are permitted for the altar, so any animal that's committed bestiality, you can't bring to the altar. Then it also says, look, it also excludes animals that were worshipped. In other words, if you committed avodah zarah with it and people worship the animal, you can't bring it obviously for sacrifice to Hashem. Then the second issue is a case where it comes to exclude an animal that was designated for sacrifice to an idol, meaning that if you were going to use it for idol worship, in other words, not to worship it, but to use it in terms of your sacrificial for an idol, even if you didn't actually sacrifice it, because obviously if you sacrificed it already, you can't sacrifice it for the temple, but you designated. In other words, you said, you made a marking or you made a declaration and said that's for an idol sacrifice. Those things you can't bring for temple sacrifices. And when the verse says, and from the flock, it comes to exclude an animal that gored a person and killed him. So it says these beasts may not be brought as offerings. Okay? So Rav Shimon said, if the exclusion of an animal that sodomizes a person is stated, why must the exclusion of an animal that gored a person be stated? Okay, the reason being is as follows. Is because there's certain animals that are eligible for the death penalty. Okay, we're gonna see why. I mean, in the old days in Africa, say for example in Kenya, I don't know if you ever saw that movie Out of Africa with. So basically, they used to have lions, and when they got a taste for blood, no, this is true, guys. When they got a taste for blood, they'd shoot the animal because the animal, like lions, etc., would go hunting. If an animal becomes rabid, or for example becomes, if you've got a pit bull, American pit bull, and it kills a person, what do you think? The SPCA aren't going to put it down. So any animal that's involved in killing is going to be put down. And any animal that's involved in bestiality is going to be put down. So just one thing to explain to you as far as that's concerned. You might say, well, we understand if an animal decided to either sodomize a man or sodomize a woman, either that or rape her from the front or whatever the case may be, that animal, because it was willing, gets the death penalty. We can understand that. But we can't maybe understand on first glance why an animal that a person sodomized deserves the death penalty. When did this come up? Do you remember we had this argument? I had this discussion with Rav Simcha Steinhauer. I don't know if you remember, Gavin. Did you join our group yet or not? Maybe not.
call it. Doesn't mean I wasn't part of the group yet.
Okay, so basically, what I said is, what did the animal do wrong? He looked at me a little bit oddly, but he told me. He said to me, look, no, because I said to him, if the person decides, if, you've got Australians and New Zealanders and certain other people that have a propensity for sheep. And I said, the sheep didn't do anything wrong, so why should it be killed? So it's to save the embarrassment of a Jew. So, for example, if a Jew used this animal sexually, they'd whisper in the marketplace, "Oh, you see Betsy there? She was his girlfriend," and they'd laugh at it, etc., etc. So this Jew was put to death for bestiality. They didn't want to sully the name of the family and the dead person already lost his life by people whispering and pointing to the animal. So it was more important to save the reputation of the family and the person that already paid with their life than to keep that animal alive and be part of social whisperings. Are you with me? That's why they killed the animal. And also you must know that animals do, if you look at the case of Parsha Noach, just as a matter of interest, that why did all the animals deserve to die in the flood? That's also a good question. So if you have a look at it, we learn that animals behave in the world according to Derech Hashem, the way we behave. So one of the proofs is that if there were two great rabbis, I don't know if they were Tanaim or what, where the one never spoke to the other for 3 days because under his jurisdiction, a Jew was killed by a lion. So you say, well, what does a lion have to do with killing a Jew? Why did he not speak to his fellow for 3 days? So apparently the nature of animals is affected by our spiritual level. So if he'd have been holding at a level where the Kohen Gadol or the leader of the generation was in a high level, no animal could accidentally kill a Jew because Jewish people would be holding at a higher level. It says it's not the snake bite that kills it's not the poison that kills a person, it's the sin that causes a person to die. Meaning if somebody is holding at the level of Adam Arishon, etc., they're not going to be affected by toxicity. They're not going to be mauled by wild animals. So basically, animals were involved in all sorts of illicit relationships by cross-species pollination at the time of Noah because they copied their human counterparts in terms of prohibited sexual activity. All right. So notwithstanding, how does this relate to the Gemara? Very simple. Is that it's saying, look, if we find that there's a prohibition under the act of animals being killed in terms of stoning, why would you have to mention that they can't be brought to the altar for sacrifice, for example? All you have to say is, look, these are the animals that are stoned, okay? Animals that murder, animals that conduct bestiality, etc., etc. And then we would know there wouldn't have to be a specific mention of why they would be excluded from the altar. All you have to say is any animal that was stoned, you don't have to bring it to the altar for sacrifice. Means if it was killed and worthy to be killed, it can't be used on the Mizbeach for holiness. That's the bottom line. Why do you have to list them specifically? Well, it says, Rav Shimon said, if the exclusion of an animal that sodomized a person is stated, why must the exclusion of an animal that gored a person be stated? And if the exclusion of an animal that gored a person is stated, why must the exclusion of an animal that sodomized be stated? Let the Torah simply exclude one of the two, and we will derive the exclusion of the other from the one that was stated by simply mentioning that, in other words, all you have to say is animals that are stoned are not eligible for sacrifice. That's all you have to say. So Rav Shimon answers because there's a stringency in the case of an animal that sodomized a person that is not found in the case of an animal that gored a person. And there's a stringency in the case of an animal that gored a person that is not found in the case of an animal that sodomized a person. So what's the stringency with regards to an animal involved with sodomy? it says the case, the Torah treated an act born of coercion like an act committed by choice. Okay? What does that mean? It's saying, look, the animal did nothing wrong and was used sexually by a male or whatever the case may be, or female. Let's not even go there in terms of how. And against, it never, in other words, it was done to the animal. Whereas in the other case, the animal was the one that initiated it. Okay? In that particular case, either way, that the animal is sentenced to death by stoning. So in other words, whether it was the animal's fault or not the animal's fault, the animal gets stoned. I explained the reason about family embarrassment and the death penalty, that we don't want the person that was killed, they to have future rumors when they point to the animal. I explained the reason. But that's why there's a stringency there where the animal volunteered to do it or it was done to the animal. But that stringency doesn't occur to an animal that killed. Because if an animal was trained to kill, we don't put it to death by stoning. If an animal killed of its own choice, we put it to death by stoning. So where's the stringency in bestiality? In other words, whether it's the animal's fault or not the animal's fault, the animal gets stoned to death. And we don't mean like the Arab version where you pelt a woman to death for stones until there's nothing left of her and she's paper mache. That's cruelty. Well, the Jewish version is that they have a big boulder, okay? And they throw this Jew off the cliff. And if he happens to survive the fall, guys, this is not a lot.
It's so much better than the other version. This is so much more humane.
Well, you know what? If you get thrown off Ponty, no. Let me tell you why. If you get thrown off Ponty, you say it's a nice view, and then you don't remember the rest when you hit the ground. It's very different to being pelted by 10,000 stones. That's very unpleasant. Now, if you happen to survive being thrown off, okay, suddenly that's it. So you see scenery and then you don't see anything. That's quick. That's not being pelted by 1,000 stones by an Arab mob. That's not fun. You could end up having your leg broken before it hits you in the temple. Fun. So then they have a big stone that they drop on top of you if you manage to survive that fall. That's why they call it stoned. No, I'm not joking. Oh, we learned that in Sanhedrin.
That's true. This. I can vouch for this.
It's true. It's true. So the thing of it is, that they put very little clothing on you. I think you wore a loincloth, or if that. And the reason being is that you didn't want the basically the clothing to cushion your fall, because if they threw you off in a jersey, that would be a very painful death. Because don't make me laugh, it's a serious matter. So basically they wanted the person to die as quickly as possible. Are you with me? Without any suffering. So with an animal, they never pelted 1,000 stones. They'd push the animal off the cliff, and Betsy would be a flat burger. If she survived, they'd drop a rock on her. I'm saying it's quick. So all he's saying is there's a stringency for bestiality. If it was done to the animal, if the animal initiated, the animal would get the death penalty by stoning. If it was an ox, there's a leniency. Only if it intended to kill and killed would it be given the death penalty. But if it was trained to kill, it would not get the death penalty because it's not the animal's fault. Hence the stringency with regards to bestiality. Now, in what way is an animal killing more stringent than bestiality? In the fact that you pay kofar for an animal that kills through caring. Okay? And you don't pay that for bestiality. There's no kofar payment at all, as far as that's concerned. Okay? Because it was necessary to state it separately, because an animal that gored a person neither can be derived from the other. So the Gemara concludes the challenge to Shmuel's view. At any rate, the Brasa teaches the following. Regarding an animal that sodomized a person, in that case, the Torah treated an act born of coercion like one committed by choice. But regarding an animal that gored a person, in that case, the Torah did not treat the act born of coercion like one committed by choice. Now, with regard to what law does the Brisa say this? It's not with regard to bringing the ox as an offering. Thus, the Brisa teaches that an ox that was coerced into goring a person may be brought as an offering. This contradicts Shmuel's view. So this is a contradiction to Shmuel. So it says, look, all it's saying is that with regards to an animal that killed a person because it was trained to do it, we don't kill the animal. So that's why Rav says you don't kill the animal. He links killing an animal that if you don't have to stone an animal, that means it's not prohibited for the altar. It's not prohibited, meaning the animal hasn't done anything wrong. So if you don't have to stone it, why can't you bring it as a sacrifice? It's valid. Shmuel said, no, the animal itself still is involved with having a person killed. It might have been trained to do so. It might not be its fault. We might not kill it, stone it, but it's certainly not eligible for the altar. That's what Shmuel's saying. So this is almost saying to Shmuel, well, look, okay, we know that's your answer, but if Rav turns around and says that you can use it, if it's not stoned and you link killing to, if you don't kill the animal, it's eligible for the altar, why can't you put it on the altar? So the Gemara rejects that challenge. It says, no, the Brisa is saying this with regard to bringing the ox as an offering, but not with regards to bringing it as an offering, but with regard to killing it. The Brisa is saying that an ox that killed a person is put to death only if it did so willingly, but not coerced. So in other words, how Shmuel would answer this is saying, listen, this is not talking about anything to do with the altar. Just because Rav is linking this issue about if you don't kill the animal, it's eligible for the altar, I'm not saying it is eligible. I'm saying it's a prohibition against killing the animal because it's not its fault, but it still killed a person. So how can you use something that killed a person on the altar for holiness? It's a good point. The Gemara buttresses this understanding of the Brisa because, and so too does reason dictate, for if you say that the Brisa speaks with regard to bringing an ox as an offering, how can the Brisa possibly say, regarding an animal that gored a person, in that case the Torah did not treat an act born of coercion like an act committed by choice? As far as offering up such an animal is concerned, neither the law of coercion is written, nor is the law of its choice written. How can the Brisa say that the Torah differentiates between coercion and choice if the Torah does not even address the issue? Rather, is the Brisa not speaking with regard to killing the animal? Yes, it is. So Shmuel's argument is saying, look, the fact that we don't stone the animal if it was coerced is derived from the verse to do with, do we kill the animal or not? And what's the exception? It doesn't even speak about this case of ox of an offering. There's nowhere where it mentions it at all. So, you can't use this as your evidence against me. Okay? Which is a valid point. In other words, he's saying this is purely to know what to do with the animal. Does the animal live or die? It doesn't mean that just because you say the animal lives, that it's entitled to be eligible for a sacrifice. It killed a Jew. Okay, it didn't plan to, so you don't kill the animal, but is this the sort of animal you want as a sacrifice? One that's tainted in this manner? I think he's got a valid point too. Okay, so just quickly, the Gemara cites one of the Brisa statements. The master said, the owner of an animal that gored a person pays kofar. The owner of the animal that sodomizes a person does not pay kofar. So in this way, we show that with regards to, remember I said there was a stringency with regards to, an animal that kills a person compared to bestiality. Again, what's the stringency of bestiality? Whether the animal is a willing initiator, or it's done to the animal gets stoned. Whereas only if an animal intends to kill, without being trained, do we kill the animal. But if it was trained to kill, we don't kill that. That's a stringency with bestiality. What, Kevin, is a stringency with regards to killing an animal is that the owner of an animal that kills pays kofar. An owner whose ox is involved in bestiality from the next door neighbor, for example, doesn't have to pay kofar. So that's a stringency when his ox kills. So the Gemara says, what is the case in which the owner of the animal that sodomizes a person does not pay kofar? If you would say that the Brisa speaks of where the ox sodomized a woman and thereby killed her, this cannot be. For what difference is it to me whether it killed her with the torn or whether it killed her with the act of sodomy? Just as the owner is liable to pay kofar in the former case, so too should he be liable in the latter. Yet the Brisa rules that he does not pay kofar. Perforce, it does not speak of a case where the person was killed through the act of sodomy. Rather than you will say that the case where the ox sodomizes her but did not kill her. But if so, the owner's freedom from kofar does not represent a leniency in the law of the animal that committed sodomy. That which he does not pay kofar is not because of this leniency, but because the animal did not kill. So what the Gemara is saying, look, if we study a particular case, you want to say that Cranberry, if you keep this up, you're going to end up with the oxes being stoned. Just go and sit down, go. So what we're saying here in the nutshell is as follows, is that, look, you want to turn around and say there's a stringency that you have to pay kofar if your animal kills somebody. So therefore it's a leniency on the fact of bestiality. And they're saying it's not true. Because if you take an animal that maybe sodomizes somebody to death, as opposed to killing them with, how do they sodomize to death? A person has internal bleeding, without being graphic. I mean, if you look at a horse, they don't use the term endowed like a horse for nothing. That thing will rupture a person's senseless. That's the reality. I'm not being crude. I'm saying that's how the person can die. That's what the Gemara is saying. So the problem is that then the animal gets the death penalty. So we're saying that what the Gemara is trying to do, guys, quickly, is use an example where sodomy, in fact, where sodomy actually results in death. And it says, well, why don't we pay kofar in that regard? So that's to say that kofar is intended to redress for the act of killing. Where there's no killing, there's no possibility of kofar. The owner of the animal that committed sodomy has not been exempted from kofar. The idea of kofar simply does not apply. Hence, his freedom from kofar of the owner does not represent a leniency in the law of bestiality. Okay? So the Gemara says, look, you don't pay kofar, and it said, look, what happens if you have an example where a person died at the hands of the bestiality? And then we say in that particular case, you don't have to. He should be liable for that particular death penalty. So the Gemara answers. Abaya says, really, then a case in where the ox sodomized her but did not kill her, how then does the owner's freedom from kofar represent a leniency in the law of an animal that sodomized a person? Because when we speak of a case where the woman was later brought before the court and they killed her for the sin of bestiality, what might you have said? You might have said that since the ox brought about to death, it's as though it killed her, and the owner should be liable for kofar. The Brisa therefore informs us that he's in fact exempt from kofar. So guys, there are two examples that were brought. What was the first example?
About regarding bestiality.
Yeah.
If the ox gored and killed, and the second one, if it gored and resulted in the death of the person. The second case was if the ox sodomized the person and killed him that way. Why shouldn't there be kofar payment for the sodomy where it applies for the goring?
Okay.
Is that the question?
Why
shouldn't there be goring is only applicable for the? I mean, kofar payment is only applicable for the goring if it resulted in the death, and not sodomy. Why shouldn't sodomy also have kofar levied?
So you're on the right track. What it's basically saying is as follows. Look, if you want to say it's a leniency, okay, if you want to say it's a leniency, it doesn't apply in a case if the woman was killed by an act of sodomy. Guys, I think I might have got it a little bit wrong. Okay. From what I understand, it posed it in a negative context question. Okay. So this is what I understand is that it's not a leniency, because then the Gemara, I apologize, guys. The Gemara seems to bring an example. Well, what happens if the ox actually killed somebody by rape, where they had internal bleeding? They're eligible for kofar. So what difference would it make if he killed with the horn or he killed with his member, the woman? What difference does it make? The owner of that ox would be eligible for kofar. Do you understand what I'm saying, Mark? What am I saying?
What you're trying to say there is, no matter which way it died, the owner should pay kofar.
Correct.
It was killed by the horn or by the member.
Correct. So what Arthur said is that the question posed is, I can prove to you, and I got this wrong before, guys, apologies. I can prove to you that there's no leniency with regards to bestiality for the kofar payment. It's not a leniency. It's because the animal killed. That's why you pay kofar. So I said, let me bring a case to you. An animal rapes a person and they die from internal bleeding, okay? Or rapes a woman and she dies from internal bleeding. Then there is a kofar payment because the woman, according to some opinions, died, okay? So therefore, it proves that this is a case where that leniency doesn't apply in bestiality. That's a proof that it's not a leniency. Because if it was a leniency, then you'd say you don't pay kofar because it's bestiality. Saying, no, what happens if the animal killed within an act of bestiality? Then you pay kofar. So that proves it's not a leniency with regards to bestiality. Does that make sense?
Just simply that that no one died. That's it.
Correct. So they're saying that doesn't. I've just given you an example of bestiality where you do pay kofar. So that proves it's not a leniency in bestiality. It proves that when an animal kills, that's why you pay kofar. But when there's no death, you don't pay kofar. It's not a leniency in the case of bestiality. So it wishes to fix that wording of the Gemara. Okay? I'm sorry I got it wrong before, guys. I'm really sorry.
That's fine. Well done. Thank you.
Okay, and I wanted to admit it. So, okay, so
Skype, Kevin, you tried your best, even though you were given the wrong information.
No, I messed up. A buyer said, look, maybe you could have said something different. What happens if it was the other way around? That a woman used an animal for pleasure, and then she gets the death penalty. Why isn't the animal killed there for kofar? Why doesn't the animal have to pay kofar? Let me explain to you why. The animal's stoned, no doubt, but why does the owner of the animal not have to pay kofar? She died. Because Abaye is saying you could have come to this erroneous conclusion. Why did she die? Because of the act of bestiality. Therefore, you can say that act of bestiality, the animal should pay, the owner of the animal should pay kofar. Because she died. Why did she die off? Because she was given the death penalty for bestiality. Therefore, since the animal and the bestiality caused her death, we might come to think that we pay the kofar in that regard, the owner of the animal, because the owner of the animal is responsible for this woman's death. And we're saying, no, we don't pay kofar in that particular case. It's bad enough that the animal is stoned and you can't derive benefit from it, hanoah, but we don't make the owner pay kofar because the woman did it to herself. She was responsible for her own death. The animal died, that's bad enough. The owner can't get benefit, that's bad enough. Why should he have to pay kofar? How was the owner negligent in any way for it killing her? She abused the animal. The animal enjoyed it before he died, but the point of it is it's not a fact. Sorry,
Thank you, man.
it's not the fact that the owner didn't look after the animal like a muad, crazy animal, and that the owner was neglectful. Yeah, the owner didn't think the next door neighbor and the ox had a relationship. He wasn't neglectful. It was a chilled animal. It was a relaxed animal. So
Very
therefore,
apparently.
So therefore, the owner wasn't negligent in his responsibility of keeping the animal relaxed. Do you know what I mean? Again, when do you pay coffee? When the animal is got a bad nature and the owner fails to look after it, he's responsible for the fact for killing a person. Here, this woman enticed the animal to commit a deed. She died because of being punished by the court with the act of the death penalty. And therefore, it's not the owner's fault that he didn't fulfill his obligations in looking after the animal. It's bad enough that the animal is stoned and he doesn't get benefit. There's no coffee payment in that case, but you could have thought there was a coffee payment. And that's why in that case, it's a leniency. So Baya is saying in that case, there is a leniency. There's not a leniency with regards to that animal that actually rapes a woman and kills, whether it's with its horn or with its member, because an act of killing was done with the animal's intent to kill. Okay, so it's only in the case where the woman brought the death upon herself does it form a leniency. Fine. Okay, we're nearly finished. And then another approach. Rava said, really, the cases where the ox sodomized her and thereby killed her. As for your difficulty of what difference is it to me whether it killed her with its horn or whether it killed her with an act of sodomy, this is the answer. When an animal kills with its horn, its intent is to inflict damage. Therefore, the owner is liable to pay kofar. But this animal that sodomizes a woman, its intent was for its own pleasure. Therefore, its owner is not liable to pay kofar. Okay? So Rava is of a different opinion. Guys, this is very important. Gavin?
Yes, I am listening. Sorry, I'm just putting something up. Go ahead, it fell down.
Okay, so this is the difference between Rava and Abaya. Rava is saying, look, there is a leniency, but because with regards to a animal that sodomizes a woman, there's no kofar payment, because we learn that kofar payment is only in the case of keren, where the animal's intent is to kill, like with its horn, etc. But here its intent is for sexual pleasure. What category does pleasure go under? Shame. When an animal rubs an itch for gratification or eats for gratification or has sexual pleasure for gratification, that's under the category of shame, not under the category of keren. And it's for that reason that it makes a difference whether it's with its horn or whether it's with its member. Because if it kills with its member, you don't pay kofar on shame, you only pay kofar on keren. That's what Rava says. Let me finish. Abaya says no, that whether the animal killed her with its member or with its horn, he doesn't differentiate between an act of regal and an act of shame. And how do we know this? Well, guys, do you remember we learned in the 26th daf about a case where there's an animal that goes into the next door neighbor's premises and trods upon and kills a child on the premises of the damaged party. According to Abaya, the owner pays kofar, notwithstanding that it's an act of regal and there's no intent to inflict damage. According to Rava, the owner does not pay kofar because there was no intent to inflict damage. Any questions before I give you the final halachic ruling? Okay, so quickly, the final halachic ruling is the Gemara Bavsata dispute between Rav and Shmuel as to whether an ox of the arena may be brought as a sacrificial offering. Rav ruled that it may, Shmuel ruled that it may not. The Gemara cites a brisa in support of Rav. A brisa has been taught in accordance with Rav. An ox of the arena that killed a person is not liable to death and is valid as an offering upon the altar, for it is one that was trained to do so. It was coerced. So,
Yeah.
Rava limits kofar to, so just one thing. If you have a look, There are 6 exceptions, which is mentioned in Bava Kamma on the 22nd daf, 22nd B, where we follow Shmuel instead of Rava. But any other case, we follow Rava, generally. Does that make sense? So we've learned the difference between Rava and Shmuel. It goes according to firstly, there's a difference between Rav and Rava. Let me just tell you something. So you have Rav and Shmuel, and you have Rava and Abaya. Okay? So in this case, Rav said the animal doesn't get killed, therefore it's valid on the altar. I'm going to finish now, kid. The animal doesn't get killed, so it's valid on the altar. Shmuel said it was still involved in killing somebody. So although it was forced and we don't kill the animal, we don't bring something involved in killing it due to the altar. It goes according to Rav that says you can bring it on the altar because if the animal isn't stoned, it's eligible for the altar. That's a different case to Rava and Abaya. Okay? As far as the case between Rav and Abaya is concerned, is that we generally follow the halacha of Rava as opposed to Abaya, except in 6 exceptions mentioned in Bava Kamma. So Rava is saying as follows, is that only when an animal conducts itself, only when an animal conducts itself with an act of keren, do you have to pay kofir. If it kills a woman under the category of shame because the animal is trying to derive pleasure from her, you don't pay kofir payment. Abaya said, listen, whether it's an act of shame or keren or regel, from higher rules in the 26th daf, when it trods upon a small child from next door, even if the animal didn't intend to, and that's the case of regel, you do pay kofir. So again, Abaya rules that you pay for kofir whether it's shame, regel, or keren. Rava says that you only pay for kofir with acts of keren. So if the animal intended to kill it with a horn, you pay. If it intended to get satisfaction and pleasure, it's under shame, you don't pay. It goes according to Rava in this case too. So we go according to Rava for that, and Rava according to the altar, animals eligible for the altar. We finished the daf, guys.
Well done.
Wow.
Well done, guys, everybody.
Damon, quick question.
Sure.
Damon, are they not eligible for the altar because it's got nothing to do with they don't become tamei. It's just because they're not. It's not tame. It's not a pleasant animal anymore. Is that why? It's got nothing to do with it. Doesn't become tamei. It's still a kosher animal in terms of its parts.
Okay, so let's separate 2 issues. There times picking up a very good point. There are certain categories of animal that are not allowed for sacrifice. We learn that if aren't eligible for being consumed, there is a category where if an animal is infected with spiritual impurity, you probably can't bring it as a sacrifice. I haven't learned so, but it makes sense to me what Kevin's saying. But we're saying there are other animals that are not eligible for sacrifice either. If Jewish people were if Jewish people did worship this animal, you can't use it as a sacrifice to Hashem. If they designated the animal to be used in idol worshipping sacrifice, you can't then use the animal to sacrifice to Hashem. If the animal was involved in killing, you cannot use that animal. If that animal killed with intent to kill without it being coerced and it's stoned, you can't. It's not eligible for sacrifice. And if the animal was involved in sexual immorality, you cannot use that as divine sacrifice. So these are just different categories. I'm sure something that's impure spiritually, you can't use as a sacrifice too. I don't know enough about it. This is just, so basically Rav is saying, look, if it's not eligible for death by stoning because the animal was trained to kill, then it's eligible as a sacrifice, because only animals that have got this prohibition against it, like bestiality or anything under the category of stoning, is a general principle you can't sacrifice it. But if it's not eligible to be stoned, you can sacrifice it. That's how the halacha goes. Shmuel says, we're not prepared to sacrifice it because it's involved in killing a Jew. How could you want something that was involved in killing a Jew to elevate this by taking it to Hashem? Even if it was trained to do it, there's more appropriate animals. So the halacha does go according to Rav, but I can understand both Rav and Shmuel's point of view. All right, guys, we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Oh, God.